off. So, hey, everybody, thanks for joining us for the latest edition of our Sales Masterclass. We're honored today to have Mark Settle, 7-time CIO, talk to us today about the formula for pitching CIOs. And then, Mark, quickly, next slide. For those who are new to Workbench, Workbench is an enterprise VC based in New York City. We lead seed rounds and enterprise startups throughout the country across data and analytics, cloud infrastructure, cybersecurity, and future of work. We've invested in great companies like Catalyst, Cockroach Labs, Fire Hydrant, Spring Health, among many more. And my name is Kelly Mack. I'm a partner on the team, focused on our infrastructure and cybersecurity investments. We are laser focused on supporting our companies through all things go-to-market and put together these master classes as a way to give enterprise founders and operators tactical advice on everything from sales and marketing to that CIO pitch. And with that, I'm excited to pass it over to our good friend, Mark, who's going to tell you a bit more about himself and what it's like to be in the CIO office.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Kelly. I am pleased to spend time with you this afternoon and very happy to be talking about how to pitch to a CIO. I thought maybe the most appropriate way to start today would be to just briefly talk about my qualifications to offer up some observations and suggestions. When I look back on my career as a CIO at 7 publicly traded companies, I have been personally exposed to literally hundreds of sales pitches. Probably, if you did a back of the envelope calculation, it kind of verges on close to 1,000 different presentations. During my tenure at BMC Software and at Okta, I actually participated in the sales process. And so I would accompany the sales team and I would pitch to other CIOs. And then finally, since the whole process of interacting, between, hang on, here we go, of interacting between, we're having some video problems with my camera. I apologize for that. I'm just going to stick with the slides for a minute. It may decide to come back on and join us here in a second. So the third source of information that I have about the different kind of pitches comes from interactions with other CIOs. And since these kinds of interactions are a source of massive frustration to many CIOs, they shared those frustrations with me. And a combination of that personal experience and shared knowledge is what's going to be the basis for my remarks today. So why pitch to a CIO? Well, this is, commonly thought of as the preferred strategy because it could, in principle, collapse the sales cycle. So if you can pitch to the ultimate decision maker in the organization and, intrigue him or her, obtain their sponsorship, in principle, it should collapse the entire process of assessment, leading ultimately to a sale. So the best possible outcome in pitching to a CIO very early in your sales campaign is to elicit that level of interest and enthusiasm. And, you'll be told exactly what other following steps need to be taken to be able to get to a final procurement. More likely, a CIO will reserve opinion and not offer a personal opinion, pro or con, but potentially give you a thumbnail sketch of some follow-on activities that he or she would like to see performed before making a decision. And of course, even that is a great outcome because it gives you a bit of a roadmap to follow in your follow-on interactions with his organization or her organization. At the same time, this is a calculated risk. So if you're early in the sales campaign, you march into a room and you have 30 or 60 minutes with a CIO, and it's obvious that they have really no interest in your product or your service, and they communicate that disinterest to the members of their team, you've effectively derailed the entire campaign. It'll be very hard to recover from that kind of a initial interaction. And so that's why some balance between a top-down and a bottoms-up approach in which you cultivate some kind of a technical champion within the organization is in many cases the best strategy. But because it is such common wisdom that, top-down is so effective, let's talk a little bit about the different vendor claims that get my attention. So the first is an intriguing and relevant business use case, and I've underscored the term business here. So let's say, for example, you're a vendor and you're offering some kind of a new no-code application development platform, and you have an existing customer that is actually using that to improve the efficiency of warehousing operations. And maybe they're a pharmaceutical supplier and they have extensive, warehouses around the country with products that they manage. Maybe I don't have that same kind of a model, but I do have warehousing operations. And if I've been told, or I can learn that there's some very significant improvements in the efficiency of the operations, maybe the retention of the warehouse staff, et cetera, that might intrigue me sufficiently to kind of want to hear that story. The second claim that gets my attention is if you have a new technical approach to something that I'm already doing, and the poster child for this kind of a claim is obviously the current hysteria around generative AI. So perhaps I have some kind of a chatbot solution that I have on my IT service desk, or perhaps in my customer support center, where end users are calling in, whether they're paying customers or internal employees, and I'm trying to provide them with sufficient knowledge to be able to solve their own problems through some kind of a scripted rule-based chatbot. And I know through surveys that they're very dissatisfied with the quality of that personal interaction. And in fact, they get frustrated because the bot really can't resolve their problem, and they get passed to a human in the end, and then they have to collect all the same information. And they get very frustrated by the time that's devoted to resolving their issue. And you come and tell me that you've deployed your capability with this generative AI technology, and the pass-through to humans is a fraction of the pass-through percentages that I'm experiencing with my current chatbot solution. So again, you've got my attention. The third claim here is one that I thought about either underlining or putting in red, because if you have a product or service that's going to generate more cost savings than that product or service costs, I'm very anxious to talk to you as soon as possible. So perhaps you have a tool or a capability to optimize SQL queries across multiple databases, or predict the cost of individual SQL queries. That could be extremely interesting to me. So I'd like to hear that story. And the final claim here that would get my attention is if, for example, you have some kind of a security tool that does 4 different things. And I currently have 2 point solutions that do 2 of those 4 things. Well, I could see that in principle, your more integrated platform might allow me to retire those 2 point solutions sometime in the future and basically rationalize the tech stack that I'm currently managing. So that could be of interest to me as well. So these are the claims that are of interest to me. But now the real challenge you have is, how do you get this information to me? And of course, like any executive, I have a full-time person who works for me who has the responsibility to keep you at arm's length at all times. And so, an attempt to send me an email or a text message or a Starbucks card through the surface mail as a way to get this information through is most likely not going to succeed. And so the way to break through my security perimeter is to generate some kind of a referral through one of these channels. So perhaps another CIO in my network contacts me and says either that they're looking at a tool and frankly, they'd be interested in a second opinion. And would I take the time to look at this thing and kind of give them some feedback before they make a final decision? I've had those kind of calls. I've also had calls where another CIO has actually purchased a new service. And we'll say up front, when I bought this tool, I told the vendor that I would help them get their foot in the door in 1 or 2 other accounts. And, I would consider it to be a personal favor, if you would spend some time with these guys and kind of see what they're doing and see if there's a potential application in your shop. And I've responded positively to those kind of requests in the past. Somebody like Kelly might call me from a venture capital firm that I've worked with in the past. And again, make the suggestion that this is a very intriguing capability. We've done a deep dive on this whole product category. We see these guys as doing something different. And that's enough of a recommendation for me to go off and take my own look at it. And then finally, really the most tried and true way of getting a referral is to, again, cultivate some type of internal evangelist for your product, somebody who's going to champion the use of your product. So maybe a member of my team went to Dreamforce, walked up to your booth, got intrigued by your capabilities, came back and did some due diligence, maybe got to your website, went to a webinar online, even took an online demo, look at the product, and has come to me and said, I really think this thing might be of some use to us. So, I'm really showing you two things here, some of the planes that intrigue me, as well as mechanisms for, getting on my calendar. So now you've succeeded. You're on the calendar. We have a meeting time coming up. What next? I want to share with you my 5 rules for an initial meeting with a CIO. So the first thing, even though many of you have probably seen the famous sales movie called Glengarry Glen Rose, in which Alec Baldwin keeps telling everybody to always be closing. This is not an always be closing meeting. This is not a sales meeting. You're developing a very initial relationship with the CIO and their team. And really the sole purpose of this first meeting is to get another meeting, okay? And you're really trying to have an initial conversation about how you're going to have a more continued conversation sometime in the future. Now, I recommend the following 2 rules that you strategize beforehand about 2 things. So the first is you should have a very clear idea beforehand what the takeaway message is for the CIO. So you're going to spend 30 or 60 minutes. You're going to run through some collection of charts. He or she is not going to absorb everything that you talk about, but you want to be very, very, crystal clear about what you want them to learn during that next 30 or 60-minute period. And one of the techniques that I've seen used that's very effective at doing this is to actually explicitly tell the CIO at the beginning, my goal today is to convince you of 3 things: that I can deliver the business value that I'm claiming, that we have a very different approach to delivering that value than anybody else that does similar things, and that I can be up and running in your environment in 60 days or less, that there's not a huge implementation hurdle. So you go through the presentation. Then at the end, you challenge the CIO. So, you know what I was trying to convince you about today. Give me a grade, or, is there anything about the way we approach the problem, the value we deliver, or the implementation time that's involved that you have doubts about? Because I don't want to leave here today with those kind of doubts in your mind. So, with that kind of conversation, you actually get the CIO to go on record about what those takeaways are. The other strategizing you should do before the meeting is to be very clear about the 2 or 3 learnings that you want to take away from the interaction. Now, if this is a completely cold call, you have never interacted with this individual or their organization before, some of the things that vendors typically want to learn is, what are the true pain points you're experiencing? To what degree are you satisfied with the solutions that you have in place to deal with those issues? And are you looking around at any other tools at the present time? Now, maybe, again, if you have no knowledge, you want to find, tactically appropriate points in this conversation to insert those questions and try to elicit a response. If you've done some degree of due diligence beforehand and you believe you know the answers to those questions, then I would encourage you to validate that learning with the CIO. So, for example, you may have dealt with a champion somewhere 2 or 3 levels down in the hierarchy of this particular IT group, who will tell you that, oh my goodness, like we deal with this set of pain points. I mean, this is some of the most frustrating stuff that goes on here. We have these clear deficiencies in the solutions that we're using today. Something needs to be done about this. And it's possible that that frustration either is not on the radar screen of the CIO whatsoever, or he or she is fully aware of it, but in the grand scheme of things, they're willing to live with, the deficiencies in the current solution and the pain that engenders, because they have other bigger fish to fry. There's other sources of pain that need to be alleviated first. So you want to kind of calibrate whatever you think you've learned from other people in the organization, again, by directly restating to the CIO and looking for some kind of confirmation. And then my last bit of advice here is you want to be careful about getting trapped in a lot of slides. I'll come back to this point later, but this is as much an exercise in time management as it is in relationship management. If you have 30 minutes or even 60, but let's take the 30-minute case, as you know only too well, the CIO is likely to show up a few minutes late. Time will be wasted with a bunch of perfunctory introductions of everybody that's in the room. And then, you'll have some time for your pitch. And before you know it, it'll be 25 minutes after the top of the hour, and the CIO is going to tell you that, they've got to leave. And there's very little time left at the end to really engage in any kind of give or take, or to determine what next steps should logically be. And if you're not careful, you'll get trapped in your own slides and feel a compulsion like, well, I have to, I've got 12 slides. I need to touch on each one of these to some degree. And the slides will actually kind of get in the way of what you're trying to accomplish. So what's on the CIO's mind, as you start the pitch? I would say these are sort of the 5 big dimensions, and I don't want to present them here in any particular order of priority, but they can range from the business value that you're going to deliver, the impact you're going to have on my budget, how you technically differentiate yourself from other people in the market, the degree to which you have paying customers that are using your product in a material way, and then what some of the implementation and change management issues might be. Now, some CIOs may have a very kind of predetermined order of priorities. And so some might think along the following lines. They would say, well, I need to be convinced this has some business value. I don't really want to worry about any of these other factors until I'm convinced of that. Once we've checked that box, now let's talk about budget impact. Like if this is too expensive, we're just wasting time. I don't even need to know about how you're technically different. And again, they'll kind of march down some predetermined order. In other instances, perhaps, they kind of randomly pivot around in these different areas, partly based on the conversations they've had with other vendors more recently. So maybe they had a recent pitch where they just, for the life of them, could not figure out how that vendor had technically differentiated themselves from the competitors in their field. And so that's the first thing that they're going to hone in on in their conversation with you. So I don't think there's any kind of predetermined hierarchy of concerns here, but I think when you go into the conversation, all 5 of these will be lurking around in the back of the CIO's mind. One other comment I'd make here is, if you initially brief say a director level or VP level person in the CIO's organization, it's been my experience that they tend to take a hard look initially at the technical differentiation. That's because they're more intimately familiar with the current solution that's in place or solutions and how effective they are. So they're really trying to understand what's different about what you're bringing to the table. And they will also have a pretty early level of attention on budget impact, because they don't want to compromise their own credibility in the organization by floating a trial balloon that's a multi-million-dollar ask, in an organization that simply can't afford that kind of an expense. So again, the priorities may be a little different if you're briefing a VP or a director during the early phases of the cycle. Okay, so these are the generic concerns. Let's talk about the checklist of what I want to know when you show up on my doorstep. Number 1, who are you guys and how did you get here? So don't necessarily assume that, I've been thoroughly pre-briefed on what this meeting is all about, or, what the expectations are. And when I say, who are you guys? I just need a thumbnail sketch of the size and maturity of your company. How long have you been around? How many paying customers do you have? How much VC funding has been invested? If you're up to a Series C level of funding, you obviously have got some traction in the market and people are betting on your ability to succeed and grow in the future. And if you're comfortable talking about current revenues at some level or range, that's helpful as well. How did you get here? Can you kind of give me the trail of breadcrumbs of, how the interactions that have already taken place in my organization? Did you already pre-briefed some people in my organization? Have you given a demo to Karen and Bob, often some department? Did you invite people in for some kind of a briefing 2 months ago, et cetera? So who have you interacted with in my organization, and what was the nature of those interactions in the past? Once we get past that, which should not take a lot of time, please don't try to educate me about problems that I live with every day. It's actually insulting and condescending. You can tell that I'm scarred by this experience. I've had vendors come in and try to explain to me that breaches are bad. A breach is bad. Oh my God, it actually has brand impact. And the cost of breaches, guess what? They're going up. Look, I have referenceable articles that show, dude, I live in this world. When I get up in the morning and put my pants and socks on, this is the world that I swim in. I don't need you to come in here and talk about problems that I largely helped to create in my own organization. So if you want to illustrate the problems you can solve, tell me about how your existing customers are using your product and use that to illustrate the pain points that you directly address. Please don't lecture me in generalities about what's happening, within the IT industry. Number 3, where do you fit in the universe of IT vendors? This is a particular sore point with me as well, because so many vendors will come in and say, well, we do a little of this. We're kind of like these guys, but we don't do everything that they do. We also can provide this functionality, which kind of duplicates somebody else, but we form partnerships with those kinds of companies. So it's a more complementary kind of a solution. And then we don't really do this, but like a little bit of what they do, we do as well. And so I call this the Wheel of Fortune approach to explaining what you actually do in terms of the competitive landscape, right? So if you're familiar with that game show, the contestants call out letters that are revealed to them sequentially in the hopes that they can actually guess what a phrase is, So they select vowels and consonants, and pretty soon somebody says, I know, it's like, in God we trust. That's it, that's the answer. And sometimes with vendors, it feels like you've got to ask around the edges 12 different questions to piece together, where they would be slotted within a Gartner Magic Quadrant universe. That's all I really need to know. I'm really just trying to understand the competitive landscape, and I shouldn't be piecing it together in some, inferential way. You should just come right out and say, if Gartner was tracking us today, they'd have us in this, and this quadrant, or, and this is a slippery slope. Some vendors will say there is no category for our product. We are inventing a category from scratch. Now you can take that and try that line of reasoning, but obviously the burden of proof tends to be much higher when you take that approach. Number 4, how does your product actually work? Okay, I'm going to shamelessly admit to you that most CIOs have, let's just say that their technical skills and knowledge have atrophied a little bit over time. And in fact, what a CIO does with almost all their time, they defend their budget, they staff their organization, they try to resolve internal personnel issues within IT, so those aren't exposed to the other parts of the company. They put out brush fires in terms of failed expectations on the part of the business functions, in terms of what they thought IT was going to deliver or when that delivery was going to occur. And finally, they try to make sure that their organization is focused on the priorities that the business has and that we haven't kind of wandered off course. So if you try to come in and explain to me the intricacies of large language models or deep learning or distributed ledger technology, it's kind of a waste of both of our times. All I'm really trying to understand, I'm trying to get some insight into the secret sauce that makes you different than other companies within your category. That's really all that I need. I don't really need a PhD dissertation about the inner workings of your product. Okay, we're down to number 5. Now, this may actually surprise you. This is a question that I like to ask. So we'll get through the first 4, and I'll say, you know what? I am totally sold on your product. I wish you had been here a year ago. I would have bought it then. So I want to build a business case that will justify this procurement. I will go back into my organization and collect whatever metrics you need me to collect to be able to justify this purchase. If you need me to go back to that service desk and find what my pass-through percentage is to the human service agent after the bot has failed to satisfy the issue, I can go get you that data. If you need to know what the storage cost is for distributed SQL queries under 5 different scenarios, I will force my team to go back and I'll have 6 months of baseline or whatever. All I need is for you to tell me exactly, quantitatively, the business metrics that I can use to justify this purchase. And I've seen many vendors flail away at that by making generalized references to improved efficiency or productivity or better collaboration. et cetera, without being able to tell me the metrics that are essential to be able to, make an informed business decision. And then the last thing here, and I think this is a question you will tend to get fairly frequently is, okay, this is interesting, but if I buy your product, is there something I can get rid of now or somewhere in the future? So you should be prepared to answer that question. And when I say that, I don't think any CIO is so naive as to think that if I buy your product today and I turn it on August 1st, by August 30th, I can actually turn off to other products. But is there just some kind of an evolutionary, transition path that will allow me to simplify my stack and maybe save some money relative to current costs if I end up using your product? Now, there are two extra credit questions that I would suggest you be prepared to answer. And these are really good questions because they imply that the CIO is already thinking ahead to possibly buying the product. And so the first is, what's it going to actually take to implement this thing? How much training do I have to do? Is there data migration that's involved? Does it have to be integrated with other tools or systems in my portfolio? Is there new staffing that's going to be required? And do I have to get new skills on my team, et cetera, et cetera? So what's the path through a normal kind of implementation? And then what are the longer term implications of this as well? Do I need some permanently assigned staff after I've built the 100th application on your no-code platform? Or who says grace over all the generative AI solutions that are out there, or maybe the models that are being developed and put into production through my machine learning team, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really trying to wrap my mind around, okay, this isn't going to be like a one-time expense or even just a recurring subscription of some type or another, but it's going to have some implications about the way we operate as an IT organization in the future. As I said before, these are great questions because they say that they're implying that the CIO has some genuine interest in how this might all turn out. Yeah, I'm coming to the finish line here, but I thought I would just briefly summarize. I've touched on some of these already, but it's almost predictable and kind of amusing the ways in which vendors can waste time during the limited time that you've given them as a CIO. It's one of the first things that they invariably, I shouldn't say invariably, that they frequently find a way of wasting time is to get into an exhaustive biographical sketch about their founders or their management team. I mean, I've had people tell me the name of the PhD thesis that their founder delivered when he was a PhD candidate at Stanford University, or somebody will recite like the 3 titles that somebody else had when they worked at Google and Facebook or whatever. So, a little bit of that kind of, peacocking around is okay. But again, we don't need to spend like 2 to 3 minutes on a person by person basis with detailed biographical sketches. Second one, I've belabored already, but please don't try to educate me about things that you've read about and I live with on an everyday basis. I don't need the PhD dissertation about the inner workings of your product. That's a complete waste of time. At best, I'm a semi-technical audience for what your product actually does. And I would advise you to be very circumspect about demos. Now, CIOs can split a couple different ways here. Some really like demos. Others, not so much, because they think to themselves, well, I'm never going to really use this tool. So, the interface, et cetera, is not great interest to me. I just want to know more about what it does. But the trap here is that when you cut to the demo, it takes a couple of seconds to switch over to the demo screen, and then you log into the system, and then you provide some initial information to the system, and then something gets processed and some result pops up on the screen, and then you modify that in some way or select something, and it goes off and it does something else, etc. And in fact, if you just had 2 or 3 sequential static view graphs in the presentation, you could just kind of go boom, boom, boom. Here's the splash screen. When you ask this question, this comes up. When you select this kind of a thing, this is the response that you get, etc. And in terms of time management, you might be much better served. If you're unsure about whether the demo or the slides would be more useful, you can actually ask your audience. And you can tell the CIO, now we can go to a demo, or I can summarize, the interactions with the system through a brief set of charts here that I've got teed up. What would you like me to do? And then try to keep everybody happy depending on their personal preference. So the reason you don't want to waste time, obviously, is you want to reserve time at the end for a thoughtful conversation about what next steps are going to be. And if you haven't done that, the CIO is sitting there thinking about their next meeting, and the best you're going to get is a shoulder shrug and told that, thanks a lot for your time. We're going to think it over and we'll get back to you. Or this was great. I'm going to talk to the members of my team, maybe, and one of them will get back to you sometime in the future, which again is a very indeterminate outcome. So this is my last slide. So let's talk about next steps. Now, the best of all possible worlds is that there is a very specific request for additional information or some form of follow-on activity. And if you're fortunate enough to get an explicit request, the request might be, I want Karen and Bob to get a detailed demo of how the product works. I'd like Mark to call a couple of your current customers and learn more about that warehousing use case. That was really interesting to me. How did they develop those bespoke applications, out in the warehouse system to achieve those kind of results, et cetera? I want to kind of double click down on that. That's really interesting how you use blockchain technology. I know we didn't have time today, but maybe I could learn a little bit more about how you've incorporated that ledger architecture within your product. So that's the best of all possible worlds. And if you're confronted with an explicit request, I strongly encourage you to make an explicit commitment. We will have the demo done within the next 2 weeks. I guarantee you that 2 weeks from this Friday, the demo will have occurred. I guarantee you that I'll be in contact with your secretary next week, and we will have those 2 reference calls, on your calendar. And then you monitor that, and then you report back to the CIO what you asked for has happened. I mean, we did it. Was the mutual learning that kind of came out of this interaction or whatever that follow-on activity was. So as I said, that's the more hopeful, positive, desirable situation. On the other hand, the CIO may not ask for anything. And so if there's no explicit request, you can do one of two things. You can ask for a homework assignment, and you could say, oh, you seem to be very interested in how we're using blockchain. I will set up a really brief 15-minute call with our chief product officer or our chief technology officer, or we're very interested in the warehousing problem and how we solve that for, Mark Settle Pharmaceutical Company. I could set up a call and you could spend a little time talking to them. So you can proactively create your own homework assignment or preemptively commit to do something. So don't even ask permission to do it. Just say, I am going to offer up, I'll go find 2 customers. I'll be in touch with your secretary. If you can find the time, and, these are really, great. These other 2 CIOs are great people. And, I think you'd enjoy spending some time with them, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't get an explicit request, find a way to make some kind of commitment in time to do things that you can report back on in the future. So these are the hooks, right, that you're kind of trawling to try to get into your whale to reel them in somewhere downstream. Then the last bit of advice may seem kind of glib or stupid or superficial, but remember that security perimeter I talked about before. Well, that poor assistant their prime job is to make sure you don't get back in. And so if you can learn something about their hobbies or personal interests or children or favorite sports activities or vacation, or whatever, and there's some way that you can schmooze the gatekeeper, that will always pay dividends in the future. So with that, I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions, Kelly, if you've got some out there.
Definitely, Mark. Thank you. That was really great. And audience, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we can go through them. Mark, we already had some questions come over the line that I'll bring up. So the first one is, how can smaller software companies, startups stand out amongst a sea of established players?
I kind of go back to the initial list of claims. If I'm looking for novelty value, novelty in the approach, It's hard to cut through that noise. Novelty in the business impact that you're having that's differential to what other people have done. Maybe sometimes the novelty, I hate to say it, but it's in the pricing, like something new has come along, and some of the more entrenched players, it's a pricing play. You can do something, and if it's a pricing situation, maybe you don't have to be better than the competition. You're just at such a lower cost that it leads the other people to the challenge. Like, why do that's a very common situation where the larger platform incumbent, has extended functionality, but a lot of the customers are only using a fraction of the functionality on the platform, and you offer some best of breed capabilities that are narrowly focused at a much lower price point. So there's different ways of doing that, but again, I think it's a novelty value kind of a thing you have to go look for.
Got it. And then actually a question just came up related to this is, how do you feel about vendors talking about competition in the pitch?
That's what I'm soliciting. And if I wasn't clear about that, that's what I want you to do. I want you to explicitly say, that these are who we're competing with. And again, I don't think you have to say, I'm going to displace those people necessarily, but we have the same, we're addressing the same generic, set of pain points as CyberArk or UiPath or whatever. And again, our novelty value is XYZ. No, I go back to the wheel. That's my Wheel of Fortune comparison. Is please don't kind of skirt that question and leave it for me to infer. And sometimes I may infer wrongly. I could 30 minutes. I could come out and say, oh, it's some kind of like AI assisted UiPath-ish thing that sounded like MuleSoft, and I think it might be like Data Robot too, but I'm not really sure. Some combination of all that. But that's all I got out of the last 30 minutes.
Right, because talking about that landscape helps situate you into what world they're playing in, basically.
Yep.
Great. Do you always need to meet with the CIO in order to sell technology to a company?
God, no. The one kind of scenario that we didn't talk about today, in a larger company, there'll be VPs that have their own budget authority. I mean, they're charged with certain set of responsibilities. I mean, somebody that's running the data team has budget, and if they want to go buy a new BI tool or a data visualization tool or a SQL optimization tool, they know more about that than I would as the CIO. And that's a situation where you might still have a CIO meeting, but it's a more kind of pro forma meeting towards the end of the sales campaign, right? It's just kind of almost a courtesy call to give the CIO a chance to ask some questions and get familiar, but the decision to buy, for the most part, has already been made. When you get to the smaller companies, most of the budget authority is reserved for the CIO, and that's the other reason why you might have to deal with them directly. People that report to him or her just simply may not have the budget authority to make a decision, and so they don't even, in some ways, they don't even want to waste their time screwing around with you, because ultimately the CIO is going to decide about the tool. So why should they invest the time in learning about how it works and becoming an evangelist?
Got it. And then are you seeing that there's a difference in approach between CIOs, CTOs, CDOs, CISOs? Do the principles that you're applying here today apply to all those other chief CXO roles?
Yes, I think they're near universal. I've shared a lot of these comments. I've shared them with somebody that says, you could just say marketing instead of IT, it would be the same kind of thing. People come in and pitch to the CMO or the chief of human resources, et cetera, for sure.
So we have a bunch of questions around cold contact. Now, I know that you mentioned, you have your security perimeter, you prefer to get things through trusted advisors or people within your team. But if someone were to reach out to you cold, what works, if any? Are there certain types of emails, certain types of reach outs that actually do get your attention?
It's very, very rare. Very rare. I don't know how else to, I've had some vendors that used to call me in the office before normal business hours and try to catch me that way. occasionally they would. Of course, now we don't really have formal office hours the way that we used to. I've seen I've seen some inbound emails that have actually some great humor. And
Mhm.
like, this is my third email. You haven't responded because either you're on holiday skiing in Switzerland, you're taking a course in yoga in the Alps, whatever, like, or you've lost interest in the product, which of the above. And my point here is sometimes I've gotten those kind of emails. I've sent them over to my own marketing team,
Mhm.
and I've said, hey, we need to do more of this kind of stuff because it got my attention. It forced me to open the email. It didn't necessarily get me to take the meeting, but at least I read the email. So it's a tough, making that initial contact. A referral is incredibly important. And I think the other thing, if you're looking for gimmicks, if you do a little bit of investigation or background work on the individual's personal background, where they went to college maybe, or where they've lived in the past, and you just can convey some level of that homework that you've done. Like, I don't know, hey, congrats on Syracuse University's football win over, Clemson last weekend. I suspect you were glued to the set. Like, that hasn't happened in 200 years, congrats. Well, that means that you did a little bit of extra homework. And again, I'll read the email. Now, whether I'm going to find the time to look at something. The other thing that I've personally done, and I think this is not uncommon, is I might get intrigued by something, but I'll refer to somebody on my team and say, I'm not going to take the time to look into this, but this sounds interesting. And this, I'm glad you asked this question. So maybe somebody on my team brought me a new vendor offering, and then I read about or hear about something else that sounds a lot like what they're talking about. So then I'll start referring inbound stuff to them, saying, you might want to look at these guys too, or maybe this is an alternative that we ought to investigate.
Helpful. Yeah. So basically, if someone's going to reach out to you cold, at least do not make it generic. Do some research on who you're
Absolutely.
reaching out to.
That's the best way to put it. Yeah, a generic thing is really going to just die. Yeah.
How do CIOs think about build versus buy versus partner options?
Well, I think most, I'm not sure I understand the partner options, but buy is the preferred option these days. I mean, it's, as far as business applications and infrastructure, are concerned. Now, you might get some, well, it depends on the tool. I mean, if it's some kind of no-code, low-code app development platform, then I guess you'd buy the platform and build on top of that. But I'm building your own tools from scratch. I think it's for internal use, which is what most CIOs are concerned. If there's like, let's say we're building mobile applications, for our paying customers, or a retail organization. In most larger companies, there's a whole separate group that's doing that. The CIO's team is largely worried about running the internal part of the company and the suite of business applications that's required and all the productivity tools and that kind of thing. They generally would not develop or even really directly support a revenue generating, capability. So a good illustration of that is, DevOps tools really typically are not things that CIOs buy directly. That's what a CTO buys or an engineering team buys or something like that.
Got it. So we actually have a couple of questions around being an early adopter and being a new tool in the market. And essentially, how does a startup who might be bootstrapped or relatively lower funded than a competitor, I guess, make the case with you that they're a viable option to work with as well?
Try that one. I mean, one more time. Got the camera to work. Go ahead.
Yeah. I saw that it just turned on. I thought we were just going pure audio. The question is when in the market, when you're looking at vendors, and you had mentioned, you like to see, how much funding they have, what are some of the logos that they currently have as customers.
Yep.
Let's say that they're a new entrant and they don't have those things. How can they make themselves attractive to you?
That's a good question. So frequently they have design partners, and I think a lot of the startups could do a better job of explaining the role of the design partner. You know, how intimately involved is the design partner? Is it just you've sent them some literature, or, you know, it's a very kind of superficial, cursory thing? Or have they really kind of rolled up their sleeves and given you some really substantive feedback? Have they done some, I don't know, alpha testing, or brought the product in-house for some kind of tire kicking, proof of concept exercise, whatever? So I think I would really use the design partners to kind of market the fact that they're, even though they're not paying customers yet, they've become substantively involved in, in establishing product market fit, right? That's what you're trying to illustrate through whatever interactions you've already had. I mean, if failing that, then I guess you do have to fall back on your own personal experience and say, when I worked at Google, we developed this, and that's what I've done. I've come out and took that knowledge that I had from the last company or whatever, and kind of gone off and on our own, like we've done something that's really great here that I'm trying to tell you about. But yeah, I think any kind of third-party validation that you can possibly have is the most valuable. Yeah.
Got it. So I think we have time for two more questions. One of them kind of going along the same lines as being a new entrant in the market, is that as you've been a CIO at multiple places, is there a good profile for what makes a design partnership versus not? Would love to understand more about when you are a design partner with companies, what does that engagement typically look like?
Yeah, I don't think there's a really clear-cut kind of normative relationship, right? I think what you're looking for is, again, kind of a roll up the sleeves, real interaction with some of the early versions of the product, and some really substantive feedback by people that are kind of doing the job today. So like if you're building that generative AI version of the chatbot for the service desk, and you tell me that, oh, pick a company, geez, I don't know. I'll go back to Okta for one. Oh yeah, somebody at Okta kind of looked at this, their title is VP of infrastructure, and they gave me some feedback. That's good, but what about the head of the service desk at Okta? Like, did he or she actually look at this thing and, I don't know, run some of their data through it, or look at the nature of the pass-throughs that occurred with the kind of questions that came in through their, do they satisfy themselves that this much improved kind of first level deflection or resolution actually occurred through the use of your product? So I think the closer you can get to the people that materially benefit from the tool, and not necessarily say, oh wow, I've got a person with a really big title, like they were the CTO at blah blah blah, and they looked at my product, and they've been giving me invaluable advice. And there could be some good advice that way, but if the advice is coming from the people that would end up really using that tool, that to me is a lot more interesting.
Awesome. And then last question, you had mentioned helping you build a business case is something great in a conversation. What are some good examples of vendors helping you build a business case to buy their product? Are they ROI calculators? Is it specific collateral? Curious to hear if you've seen any best practices there.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of vendors have some kind of a diagnostic tool where they come in, and actually that's the immediate response is, well, yeah, that'd be great. So let me send in, and we want to sit down in your organization, and we want to collect the metrics that we need to be able to present the business case to construct that ROI argument. I have two suggestions there. So, one is make sure that you're very explicit about the amount of time that's going to take place. Because I think a lot of CIOs, myself included, when you say, I want to come in with a team and I want to talk to more people in your organization, a lot of my initial reaction is, well, this is just a big fishing expedition. Why? I don't want to turn you loose in my organization, waste a lot of people's time. So I think it's important to be very clear about, we'll come in, there'll be two of us, we'll be there 3 days, we only need to talk to 6 different types of people. You know, you tell me who does this, who does this, who does this. We'll need to spend maybe like 30 minutes of our time with those 6 individuals. It won't be a big strain or imposition on your staff. That's kind of number one. Number two is most most IT organizations, again, in the larger company, are going to have their own like internal financial team, right? That helps with everything financial, running projects and tracking variances and doing other stuff. Not from the CFO's central organization, but these are people that work for me, my own IT finance group. And I would strongly encourage that if you send your own team in to collect these metrics, definitely try to engage and solicit the participation of one of my financial ops people. Because the reason that I suggest that is there'll always be the presumption that whatever numbers you bring back to me, you have tweaked whatever input you received in ways that maximally favor your business case. But if you had my finance guy, gal, looking over your shoulder as you collected those metrics and say, you know, yeah, I mean, they were pretty conservative. You know, they said, well, okay, maybe we're not going to see like, you know, reduced pass-throughs from 100%, well, 100%, pass-throughs from like 50% down to 30%. So we'll take like a conservative case. Maybe it goes, you know, et cetera, et cetera. If your internal finance person says, yeah, these numbers are about right, you know, they didn't, this isn't overly biased in a way that makes their product look like it's a superstar product, then that the credibility, the outcome of that exercise will be greater. But people are leery of fishing expeditions. But again, you know, if you have existing customers, and I understand everybody has existing customers, but even the people that don't have customers should be coming out of experiences where they have some, you know, personal insight into how these functions work, you know, how these operations work within an IT organization or within a company, and be able to, you know, formulate what those metrics are that need to be tracked.
Right. Actually, last question related to this is, when it comes to the procurement process, what does that typically look like, and what is the CIO's role in that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I'm only laughing because, again, there's no normative process, and it can be pretty haphazard at best. It's not always. I mean, some, again, larger, more sophisticated companies might have different procedures for different sized procurements, and with obviously more due diligence. The bigger the spend or the spend commitment that's being made, kind of more hoops to jump through. They'll also have maybe more rigor around, you know, competitive pricing. You got to get quotes from 2 other competitors. You know, I don't think there's a really normative process. It can be pretty difficult. And I do have one interesting observation though, that there is a lot of human emotion involved in these kinds of campaigns. And when you can't close a deal in a quarter, there's a lot of talk about it slipping out of the quarter, and we'll get back to it like early next quarter and get this thing closed. And I think more often than not, that does not happen, because there's kind of like this crescendo, if you will, of like emotion around, let's push it through the security checklist. Let's get it pushed through procurement. You know, let's get it pushed through the GDPR compliance people, you know, whatever we've got to do. And we're trying to do this. And if you lose the pressure of end of quarter or some other deadline, it could be a project deadline or whatever, it's kind of like some of the air comes out of the balloon, and it gets progressively more difficult to get people to focus attention on it. So it's good to, you know, have some kind of a procurement deadline that you're driving to. The other thing that I've seen pretty effective is an offer to send somebody physically to the customer site and sit there until the deal is done. Whatever it takes. We want to have that. We want to get it done, you know, by the end of August, and I'll send people physically. We'll sit in your conference room and, you know, redline anything, resolve issues, you know. And usually what happens if that occurs, then your rep goes out to dinner with their rep, you know, they get to be friendly, and the whole thing gets taken care of, you know, without a whole lot of anxiety or angst.
I feel like we could do a whole other webinar just about closing the deal. Right?
Yeah, that would be fun. We could do that.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thank you so much for the time. Thank you, attendees, for for joining us today. We're going to have a recap blog post put out by the end of this week, as well as the video and the slides up on our YouTube. Thanks again for joining us. Again, Workbench Early Stage Fund. We put together a lot of these webinars to contribute to the community, to you founders, to you operators out there. So hope to see many of you again in the future. And thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Kelly.